This is the fourth in a series of energy management, and I wanted to talk more about how to get the most out of the energy you have. Remember, we have a Class B RV. It is very well insulated and has a powerful 12-volt lithium battery system. Keep this in mind when working with your own motorhome and power systems. In order to use energy in a way that isn't wasteful or difficult to manage, you'll need to ask yourself the following questions. First and foremost, you need to know how many usable watts you have. And by usable, I mean the amount of power you can safely use from your battery so it will not get damaged. Lithium batteries are sold by the total amount of watts they have, not by what is actually accessible to you as a consumer. For instance, our system is 920 amps, which is roughly 12,000 or so watts. A battery management system, or BMS, will control the amount of power you can access from that total so you don't completely drain the battery, which could damage it. This means you have a lower amount of usable watts than what is listed for the battery total. This safety factor can be set to anything from 10 to 20% of the total amount of wattage you have. This will be the amount you won't be able to access. For instance, the usable watts available in a 12,000 watt battery may be as low as 9,500 watts, and at best no more than about 10,500 usable watts. This is based on the BMS settings, so you don't really have 12,000 watts to play with. So now you know how many watts you have, but where do you get power when you run out? One of the most important ways to understand power management is to understand your travel style. For instance, if you're in an RV park every night and can hook up to shore power, you shouldn't have issues running out of power. But if you boondock where there's no power, it's a completely different story. Of course, there are flavors in between these two extremes, so your mileage may vary. The point is, your travel style affects how you use power and how you get that power back by charging your batteries. There are various ways to do this. 30 amp shore power at an RV park, 15 amp household plug from your home, solar panels connected to your RV, a second alternator while you drive, or maybe a generator. You can of course mix and match a lot of these sources of power, for instance by having solar panels on your roof while you're driving and charging your batteries. Now that you know how much usable power you have and how you will charge the batteries, you need to think about the time it takes to do all of that charging. This is important because it can influence your travel schedule. You need to be sure you have the time you need to do a proper charge. It's relatively easy to approximate how long this takes, and I say approximate because there are a lot of variables. Let's say you have a battery with 10,000 usable watts, and you're down to a 50% depth of charge. That means you need to add 5,000 watts to fully charge that battery. You need to know how many watts are going into the battery and divide the 5,000 by that number. So a 30 amp shore power connection is rated at 120 volts. You know that multiplying amps and volts gives you watts. So you're getting 3,600 watts of power. As I said, there are a lot of variables. You don't know how efficient that shore power is or even if it's that reliable. In our case, we set our system to only accept 27 amps instead of 30 amps to account for any fluctuations or discrepancies. But assuming you could get 30 amps, it should take just under 1.5 hours to charge the battery system. When we're home and parked in our driveway, we use 15 amp household power. This is also 120 volts, so that would be 1,800 watts. Again, we know that this power fluctuates, just like 30 amp shore power. So we set our system to only accept 13 amps. But if you could get all 15 amps, it would take just under 3 hours to fully charge the battery system. Now, solar is hard to pin down. A Class B RV can usually have somewhere around 100 to 400 watts of solar on the roof. Assuming you have 400 watts, it would take 12.5 hours to charge the batteries. But that isn't really true. You see, the angle of the sun is going to determine how efficient those panels are, and that sun moves across the sky. No. We move, so the angle of the sun changes. Not only that, but the sun may be blacked out by clouds, rain, or a thing called the Earth, because it's nighttime. So you really don't get 400 watts, and a lot of the time you don't get any watts, and no charge. Alternators are hard to pin down too. They have different amperages, so I just chose one randomly, a 200 amp alternator, which gives you 2,400 watts, or just over 2 hours of charge. There are variables here as well. A lot depends on your engine's RPM at the time, so keep that in mind. Generators come in different flavors, so again, I just chose a 2,000 watt generator, which would mean about 2.5 hours of charging time. You also have to think about the lack of power. What do you do if the power you thought was there isn't? For instance, that RV park shore power might have issues like no ground or too much voltage fluctuation. Or maybe it's raining, so your solar panels are next to useless. Or you're kind of low on gasoline, so don't want to run the engine for that second alternator. Whatever the issue is, always have a backup plan. In our case, we drive all day. So we arrive at our destination at 100% capacity because we have a second alternator. So no need to worry about charging for at least that night. But if we're staying put in one spot for a while and not driving, we can still run the engine to charge the batteries. It takes a little longer, but it does the job nicely. All we use is some gasoline. Of course, we have to make sure we have gasoline in the tank for this plan to work. We do carry a heavy-duty extension cord, so if household current is available, we can at least use that. You need to figure out what gets turned on in your RV on a regular basis and how much power it needs. Your lights may not use a lot of watts, but they may be on for a long time. Conversely, your microwave uses a great deal of power, but is only on for a few minutes. Look at the watts these things use and determine how long they'll be on. If you don't know the wattage, there are many different appliance load charts you can find on the internet to help. I've got one linked in the description below. You can find the watts per minute just by dividing the watt hours by 60, then add all those watts up to get a general idea of how much power you'll need each day. This is of course just an estimate, but it will help you determine how long you can last between charges. Just divide the usable watts you have by the amount of watts you use. So if you're using 1,000 watts a day, you divide that 10,000 watt hour battery by 1,000 watts and you get 10 hours. Remember, this is only an estimate, so you might want to err on the side of caution and reduce that figure to 8 hours just to be safe. And now we come to one of the more demanding power consumers. No, not your air conditioner, but your inverter. You need to have the inverter on anytime you power something that is 120 volts, since the batteries are at much lower voltage, in our case 12 volts. The issue is, inverters need power when they're on, even if they aren't converting anything at all. Inverters have what is called no load or idle power, a power it uses when on, but not inverting power. This draw can be anywhere between a 50th of an amp to an entire amp an hour, which would be between 2.4 to 120 watts an hour. So, while your inverter is sitting idle, but still turned on, it's still using power. The more inefficient the inverter, the more power it draws, wasting energy that does nothing for you. Now you might be asking, why is the inverter on? And why is it using power just sitting there? Well, think about when you're at home and you want to microwave something. Do you need to prepare the microwave to go on, or do you just press a button and it runs? It's plugged in at all times to an outlet providing 120 volt power whenever you need it, so it's ready to cook at a moment's notice. You don't even think about it. Your microwave in the RV is also plugged into an outlet that provides 120 volt power, but it can't do that from a 12 volt battery. It needs the inverter to get that 12 volts turned into 120 volts. The inverter doesn't somehow know when you're going to use the microwave, so it has to be powered up and ready to go when you are. It's like a dog. It's always ready to play. So that inverter is using power just waiting for you to do your thing. Like a dog, ready to play. The power required to run an inverter that is actually powering something is far greater than when it's sitting idle. On average, it needs around 10% more power than the power load of the item it's powering. So let's say you're powering a 12-volt, 1500-watt air conditioner that runs about a third of the time to keep you cool. That would be about 500 watts an hour. Let's also say you have a battery with 10,000 usable watts. 10,000 divided by 500 equals 20 hours of runtime. But what if you have 120-volt AC? You need the inverter on, which is going to use an additional 10% of power, or 500 watts times 10%, which equals 50 additional watts, or a total of 550 watts needed to run that 500 watt of AC. 10,000 divided by 550 equals about 18 hours of runtime. You just lost 2 hours of AC because you needed the inverter on. And that assumes the AC is only running about a third of the time, or 20 minutes each hour. So it's only using an average of 500 watts an hour. What if it gets hotter so the AC has to run longer, like 30 minutes an hour? That's 750 watts an hour, and that would mean the inverter needs 750 watts times 10%, which equals 75 watts, or 825 watts total to run the 750 watts of AC. 10,000 divided by 825 equals about 12 hours of runtime. Another 6 hours lost. And think about this. We only went from 20 to 30 minutes of runtime. Just 10 more minutes lost 6 hours of cooling in that RV. Finally, you need to ask yourself, how are you going to save energy so you can last longer between charges? There are a lot of ways to accomplish this. If you don't need it, turn off the inverter. You see how much power it wastes just being on. If it's cool enough outside, open windows so you don't need to run one of the biggest users of power in the RV, the air conditioner. And speaking about keeping cool, keep the van out of direct sun. You're inside a tin can, and that gets hot quickly. You can also consider better insulation. Now, you could pull apart panels in the van and see if you can add insulation, but that's a lot of work. So you might want to look at things that are somewhat less difficult, like using window covers, preferably insulated. They may cost a bit to purchase, but they will help keep cool air in on hot days and warm air in on cold days. Partition off areas you aren't using, like between the driver's area and the rest of the RV. Those windows up front are huge heat transfer areas, and blocking them off helps tremendously. And it also means less space that needs to be temperature controlled. Consider visiting cooler areas in summer and warmer areas in winter. You may not need the AC or a heater for most of the year. If your plans allow it, after you've visited the sites you want to see that day, change your elevation and drive up a few hundred feet where the weather's cooler. A city may be up to 10 degrees hotter than the surrounding countryside. Going up that mountain could offer more shade trees to park under, and you won't have the city streets emitting all that heat they absorb during the day. I'm sure there are other ways of conserving energy on your trips, and I would recommend taking every opportunity you can to charge up those batteries so you won't find yourself with less than ideal power resources. If you think of anything, add it to the comments and share your knowledge. Be seeing you. Now you have seen the videos based on research and bad acting. Can you prove that these videos did not happen? Perhaps, maybe on your way from one end of the RV to the other, someone will pass you in the dark, and you would never know, for your batteries were turned off. Many RVers believe other ways to power motorhomes exist at this moment. We once rode the horse, drove the gasoline automobile, called the car phone, lit up with the light bulb, listened to the record player, and even watched analog television. And now, some of us are getting our energy from batteries. And that may help us in the future.